Very nice to see you all. My name's Pat Carney. We're very pleased this morning to welcome our guest speaker, Anne Lyles. Anne is a huge, towering figure, art historian of British art, specialising particularly in Constable and indeed in Turner. And she's speaking to us today about Turner and Constable as rivals and colleagues, chime with the exhibition that's opening at Tate Britain next week. 25 years really at Tate, and now freelance. Huge amount of exhibitions being curated by Anne on Turner, an exhibition and Constable. I don't know if many of you remember that the Royal Academy, in this sort of glimmer of light and hope at the end of the COVID pandemic, the Royal Academy had a Late Constable exhibition, which was fantastic. It was curated by Anne. So without further ado, I'll let you get on with it, and we'll have questions at the end.
Welcome everyone. This is going to be, there's a lot to fit into this lecture, because just talking about Turner alone, which take I don't know how many lectures, not to mention Constable as well. So what I plan to do today is just to take some key points, key images by the two artists, a bit of compare and contrast. What this lecture is not going to be is a tour through the exhibition that you will see at Tate Britain, strikes permitting, although quite a lot of the pictures I'm going to show you will be in the exhibition. So it's very unusual. I don't think, to my knowledge, anybody ever before has done an exhibition where they've compared and contrasted Turner and Constable side by side. And it will be side by side, but as I understand it, I've advised a little, but I haven't seen the final plans. What it won't be in the exhibition is one Turner, one Constable, one Turner, one Constable. There'll be rooms where, well, let's say in an average room you have 4 walls, two. Well, of course, you can sometimes have screens in between. But there'll be 2 walls for Turner and 2 for Constable and so on. So they'll breathe a little bit from each other. And also, I'm not here to promote other people's books, but it is an amazing coincidence that there is a book on this very subject about Turner and Constable, as seen side by side, if you like, that's come out just very recently by Nicola Morby. So if any of you want to know the background, that is a wonderfully accessible book. So starting then with the first 2 slides, the Fighting Temeraire by Turner on the left and the Haywain by Constable on the right. The Fighting Temeraire actually dates from 1838, so the year after Constable died. But these are the 2 classic, most famous examples by both artists. Pat was kindly talking about towering figures, but the true towering figures are Turner and Constable, and no doubt they will, the towering figures of their generation, and no doubt will attract huge audiences for the exhibition. These 2 pictures respectively, in a poll some years ago, about 20 years ago, you know how they have these polls like, what is your favorite painting? And that changes a little bit from generation to generation. But one of these polls, it was a newspaper poll, came up with, these were the nation's favorite paintings, perhaps because they're the most familiar. Turner's Fighting Temeraire and of course Constable's Haywain. And for me, having worked on Turner and moved to Constable, people would sometimes say, well, why do you want to do that? I mean, look, Turner, all the colour, the variety, travels everywhere. The perception of Constable a little bit is that he's narrower, and he does have a narrower focus. But within that focus, he's superbly rich, the variety of expression within a limited subject matter. So for me, moving to Constable has not been a problem. But for other people, they can't resist comparing and contrasting. And this will happen in the exhibition, I'm sure, especially with the journalists. And it happens whenever, by coincidence, there was an exhibition of late Turner that was on at the same time as an exhibition at the V&A on Constable, and the journalists just, in different venues, the V&A and the Tate, and the journalists couldn't resist saying, who's the better? For me, And also for Nicola in her book about Turner and Constable, it's not a question of taking sides. Their differences illuminate the qualities that defines each. And the argument here, when I had the title Rivals or Colleagues, is that in the end, they were doing the same thing for the benefit of British landscape art, which is to raise the status of landscape into an independent art form at a time when landscape was rather low in the hierarchy of accepted painting genres. And I'll talk a bit about that later when we have some more slides. So what I wanted to integrate into this talk as well is a bit of biographical information, because Turner and Constable couldn't, in a sense, be more different as personalities and in relation to their backgrounds, although it's clear that they did certainly respect each other as fellow academicians, doing, as I just mentioned, the same thing, caring about elevating the status of landscape painting. Turner, you probably know, a self-portrait there about 1802 at the Tate, was the son of a barber and born in Covent Garden. And on the far right, you see the home where he was brought up. You see the shop window, which is where Turner's father ran the barber's shop, with access through a little alleyway at the side. And Turner's father was so proud of his younger son's talents that he used to put his early little watercolours, topographical watercolours, in the window. In the middle is a sketch which is quite interesting. I'll talk a little bit later about Turner's commitment to the Royal Academy and taking on a role in the first decade of his life as Professor of Perspective. And his devoted father, who you see in profile in the middle there, Turner's eyes are just below as he's looking down at the lectern like me, and concentrating on his lecture. The devoted father went to all those lectures. So Turner then, modest background, father a barber, and very sadly his mother developed serious mental issues, form of dementia or whatever, which in those days there were no cure for other than putting you into an asylum. And it may be that the death of her daughter, Turner's only sibling, may have started this cycle of madness. But so sadly, Turner really only had his father for immediate family, although there are complications there, which I'll come to later. Constable, by contrast, in a portrait here of a similar date, 1799 on the left, was the second son of 6 children of Golding Constable there on the right, who sometimes, I'm sure you know that Constable was brought up in East Anglia. He was born in East Bergholt. His father had a mill at Flatford for grinding corn. And sometimes Constable's father was just called a miller, but actually he was much more than that. He was actually a merchant. He was a substantial property owner. He had storehouses at Mistley, which he rented for where the corn was stored before it went on to London on boats that he owned. And then coal, which would be landed from Newcastle, would come into Mistley, and that would come upstream on barges. So he was middle class, wealthy. He built this house that you see below in the image in the V&A below, a 3-story brick house that sadly no longer survives. It was pulled down. We're not quite sure why. Presumably it wasn't in very good condition in the middle of the 19th century. But you can see that's quite some property with East Bergholt Church on the left there. And this is actually where Constable himself was born. So Constable then has a better start in life in terms of a loving family, devoted mother and father, 5 siblings, a very, very happy family. But the problem was that the father wanted Constable to take over the running of the mill, because Constable's older brother, Golding, was not very competent, sadly. So that's why Golding had set his eyes on Constable taking over the mill and didn't want him to train as an artist. So I mentioned we'd talk a little bit about context in terms of Constable and Turner and wanting to raise the status of British landscape painting within the context of other art forms or subjects. And for this, I dare say you're familiar, but I think it's worth reiterating here, just to, if you like, underline the achievement of Turner and Constable alike, is the expectations of what a painter might become, how they make their money, and how they might succeed in becoming a full Royal Academician. Because, of course, at this period, after 1768, when the Royal Academy was founded, and on the left you have Joshua Reynolds, who was its first president, proudly showing himself in the context of a plaster bust of Michelangelo, who he so admired and included deliberately in the self-portrait. I'm sure you know that Reynolds, as I say, was the first president of the Royal Academy and very famously gave a number of lectures which became published as discourses. And those discourses set a sort of benchmark for advice for artists as the type of subjects they should paint, who they should look up to in terms of predecessors and so on. Reynolds, who himself, as we know, was mainly a portraitist, for him and for a lot of academies at this stage, landscape was rather near the bottom of the pecking order of subjects that were highly regarded, and it was rather low along with things like still life. At the top of this pecking order was what was called history painting. So, of course, the great Italian masters, Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, they'd all concentrate on big historical, biblical, or mythological pictures. And these were the ones that Reynolds implied British painters should be aiming for as well. Though, of course, British painters didn't have patrons like in Catholic countries in the same way. You know, England, Protestant country, everybody wanted their portrait painted. So this was a bit of a problem in the early 19th century. On the right, of course, is the first true home of the Royal Academy, Somerset House, purpose-built, William Chambers, with special rooms for the Royal Academy and other societies, the Society for China, the Society of Antiquaries. And of course, when we come to looking, which we will do soon, at the so-called Great Room, which was the main display area at the top of the Royal Academy rooms, you will know that now as one of the display spaces at the Courtauld Institute, which now occupies what the old Royal Academy was. So moving on now to what you see on the screen. One thing I wanted to emphasize in terms of this rivals versus colleagues is that both Constable and Turner were heavily invested in a commitment to the Royal Academy and its teaching schedules and its aims, despite the fact that landscape was regarded as a rather lowly category. They had no choice. If they both wanted to be successful artists, both aimed, as most artists did in this period, to become a full Royal Academician. Though first you had to qualify as an associate Royal Academician. And in fact, Turner was so talented that he became a full Royal Academician by 1802, whereas Constable had to wait until 1829. And we'll see why in a moment, that what held Constable back. But I just wanted to say, you remember we saw the picture of Turner's father and Turner's eyes below looking down when he was giving a lecture. Probably that was made during one of his lectures on the history, an explanation about how perspective worked generally in drawing on a two-dimensional surface. And as you probably know, at Tate Britain, Tate Britain houses the full contents of Turner's studio at his death, which includes all his working drawings and watercolours. And in and amongst those are some of these very beautiful diagrams that he made in connection with his lectures, including the one on the right, the reflection and refractions in a transparent globe, which is, as you can see, not full of water. And apparently Turner was not a good communicator. He just didn't have the lucidity of, he didn't have any natural lucidity. He found it quite difficult to explain himself. He wasn't a very good letter writer. Constable, by contrast, was superbly lucid with his views, and there's a massive correspondence which survives by him. But that, of course, was mainly private and kind of behind the scenes, although it is actually all published now, if you ever want to read it. On the left, I put there an early by Constable. He was actually a very good figure draftsman, perhaps slightly better than Turner. I'm not trying to take sides, they both have their strengths, their particular strengths and less strong points. But here you could see a man in a strained pose, so you can see it heightens the musculature, which Constable's depicted very well. And remember that study because it looks as though he may have used it in reverse for a later painting, which we'll come to in due course. But I mentioned the Constable here because although, as I mentioned, it took Constable a long time to become a full Royal Academician in 29. When he did become one, he was hugely committed to the Royal Academy. He went to all their meetings. He later on in the 1830s, he was in charge of what was called the life class. So he set the nude figures in positions like he'd drawn himself years before. And the students really enjoyed that life class. He was a superb teacher. So this is the two of them committed to the Royal Academy. So that's some of the background. Now what I'm going to do is go through some direct comparisons between the two artists, which will emphasize, I hope, the extent to which Turner was something of a prodigy. Constable started off being a bit of a plodder, but he got there in the end, the tortoise and the hare and so on. So they were sort of level pegging by the second half of their respective careers. And we'll see that the critics, actually they don't say very interesting things, the critics, the journalists at the time, but they do start comparing the two artists directly later. So Turner started off mainly flexing his sort of artistic muscles with watercolours. So what you see here on the left at the Tate is actually what one would call a finished, polished watercolour suitable for exhibition, as opposed to some of the looser, very expressive watercolours that exist still in our Turner bequest. And you can see it's a rather kind of Claudian formula. I'm going to introduce one or two. I mean, it's hard enough to try not to get enough Turners and Constables in this talk without including the old masters on whom both artists are dependent. And I will include the odd Claude and make references to Poussin and so on. But I'm sure you're familiar with the Claudian formula of the framing trees and the different, the three-way perspective of the foreground, the middle distance, and the background often sort of in a kind of misty haze. That's a very Claudian formula. Turner had been travelling in the 1790s throughout Britain, throughout the UK, because of course, during this period in the 90s and mainly up until 1815 with the old pause, the continent was out of bounds to travellers, for artist travellers, because of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And that in itself opened up Britain more because artists had to concentrate on what was on their doorstep. That opened up artists to the beauty of their own scenery. There was a bit of a fashion at this time for presenting scenery in a kind of picturesque way, you know, with sort of crumbling brickwork and lots of sort of rough foliage and stonework in the foreground, sort of a little bit in the manner of Dutch painting. But of course, the other thing to bear in mind is that this also generated a huge picturesque topographical literature. So a lot of these sorts of watercolours could then be published as prints, and sold either as individual prints or in serials, and print publishers would make a nice bit of money. So here we've already got quite a distinction between the two. We've got Turner showing Carnarvon Castle in this Claudian manner with a nice sort of figurative foreground, a bit like Claude, but into which he's posed a Welsh bard playing his harp to people sitting and listening. So, you know, a bit anachronistic time-wise, because we've got a modern Wales, Carnarvon Castle, and then these historic figures. And then we've got a really quite timid but finished watercolour by Constable, which was made as a sort of wedding present for somebody who lived locally called Lucy Hurlock. But you can see it's a bit more like what one would call a tinted drawing in those days. Before watercolour was fully developed, there was a kind of very careful structure drawn in underneath in pencil, and the colours were neutral colours were kind of tinted in. So this is Constable painting a rather low-key topographical work in a kind of panoramic format for a local Suffolk friend. So Turner then, Turner being Turner, sort of goes off great guns. He's mainly been a watercolour artist in the 1790s, but early on in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, in the first decade, he makes his reputations with these very large oil paintings. Now, I haven't given the measurements for most of these images you'll see, but when they're either very large or very small, and I'm trying to make a point I have, so you'll see how very large this Turner is of the 10th plague of Egypt, the massacre of the firstborn, and you can see how it owes something in terms of looking backwards at earlier old masters to Nicholas Bucer. And it should be said that all artists in this period, Constable included, they knew their own masters. There were not public art galleries. To speak of what the Dulwich Picture Gallery opened in the early 19th century, but what you did as an artist, if you wanted access to old master drawings, you went to the sales. Christie's had been founded by now, or you got to know patrons who knew all the private collectors and got you into their houses. So, or you collected prints. Constable was an amazing print collector. So he got to know the images of a lot of these old masters. So artists in this period, Turner and Constable, they knew their own masters backwards. But also what Turner's doing is trying to make a very noticeable homage. He's channeling, I think is the trendy modern expression. He's channeling Bucer knowingly so that he can get a few ticks, if you like, in the context of the Royal Academy. And also, if you painted large, and if you painted in acknowledgement of what had gone before the old masters, you might get a better placing in the Royal Academy Great Room. So this is an example of the Great Room, the top room, now where the courtyard is, and it used to have lots of, I think it's still got a few screens in that room, but I think they had a false ceiling before, and they've opened up the ceiling. So do look up and you'll see this magnificent chambers ceiling. So this is, okay, you've got the entrance here from the right. So that is the first room, the kind of preamble room. This is the so-called Great Room. And if you painted large, the chances are you might get a placing, like you see that historic subject in the middle of one of the walls. The larger you painted, and if you managed to have lots of, if this subject was sufficiently important, you might get a really good placing. That meant the critics noticed it, and this was this kind of win-win. But, and of course, the other thing about the critics is they obviously couldn't comment on every picture. You can see how densely hung a Royal Academy exhibition was, literally frame to frame. So the critics tended to comment on the best known artists, who were almost invariably the Royal Academicians. So Turner got lots of notice from early on. Constable really only started being noticed by the critics for about 1814-15. So, you know, he was a slow starter in every respect. The critics weren't noticing because a friend once said, your subjects don't solicit attention. They were too modest, too small, too low key, until later, which of course we'll get to. So interestingly enough, that 10th Plague picture was shown in the Royal Academy in 1802, an exhibition that Constable attended, and said he was rather depressed at what he saw by his contemporaries. There was nothing worth looking up to, he said. Everybody was, all the pictures were dependent on pictures of the past, and he could do better, he said in a letter to a friend. And he said he was going to go back to the East Berghof, which he, of course, knew backwards. It was familiar territory, and he was going to start making some modest studies from nature, one of which is this picture lower right, which is in the V&A, and will be in the Tate exhibition. You can see how tiny it is. Now, we don't know in the early years quite which pictures were exhibited, because Constable tended to, the lists of the Royal Academy catalogues, certainly they survive and they're very useful, but they're quite basic. They don't give measurements, and they'll tend to say, they'll give you a number where, so you can probably work out roughly in which room the picture was hanging. But as I said, they don't give measurements, but Constable gave them very kind of bland titles like A Study from Nature. So we think this was probably exhibited in 1803, this modest picture on the left, which is a view of Dedham Vale. And by now, of course, Turner had been off. I mentioned about the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and you probably know in 1802 there was a temporary peace, the Peace of Amiens, which only lasted a few months. But so people like Turner, who were very ambitious, couldn't wait to see, well, allegedly Italy, but in fact he spent most of his time in Switzerland and France, and only had time to do little short escapade into Italy. But this is what he painted when he came back, Vaudeville, Savoy. So, you know, he's increasing his repertoire. So it's entirely typical of the difference between Turner and Constable, and this will no doubt be investigated in the exhibition, that in 1802, Constable goes back home. He's not interested in travelling abroad. He wants to make something special of subject matter he felt a very personal connection towards, whereas Turner is always on the wing, so to speak, an inveterate traveller, go wherever he can manage it. So again, very different in scale, but probably shown in the same Academy exhibition. So I mentioned I'd have the odd slide of an old master, and of course here I've got the Claude Lorraine of Hagar and the Angel in the National Gallery, which was actually a gift, a sort of near founding gift from a patron called Sir George Beaumont, who you see on the left. And he was a patron of many artists. He wasn't very keen on Turner, as it happens. He had very good rapport with Constable, but never bought anything by him. So that's not very supportive, but he supported Constable in many, many other ways. He was always lending him his carriage to go and see private collections. Later on, he expected Constable and his assistant to mend holes in his canvases in his collection. That was the kind of more artisan side of the way that artists were regarded in this period. But Constable had an introduction to Sir George Beaumont early on through his mother. There was a Suffolk connection. And Sir George's favourite picture in his collection was this little Claude. that later was presented to the National Gallery, and used to travel with it everywhere, a special little setup made in his carriage so he could travel with it everywhere. And clearly the Constable is indebted to that. So what I would say is, whilst Turner is obviously indebted to the Old Masters and wants you to know, and takes on the Old Masters in competition, don't kid yourself, if you like, that the Constable doesn't also know the Old Masters really well. He just disguises his homage by treating his own scenery in a more naturalistic way, in a way that doesn't jump out quite so obviously. But he is, as I say, equally knowledgeable about the masters of the past. This comparison will be in the exhibition, I know that for a fact. And I think probably fairly early on in some of the early rooms, because it tells you this is where we see the artists side by side, you know, with the same values, the same homage to the past. Obviously, these two paintings are rather different in date, and you can see the difference in handling. And actually, for me, the most interesting thing moving from Turner to Constable was that my own personal opinion is that Turner is sensational as a watercolour artist. I think better as a watercolourist than an oil painter. Whereas Constable, I think, is the other way around. He is the most phenomenal. I mean, they're both amazing. But if you want to take their strong points, I think that Constable is the most amazing oil painter and constantly inventive in the way he uses paint. And you see the differences here. But what you get here, of course, are the similarity of the homage and the idea of the bridge in the middle distance. And actually, the irony is that the Turner is based on a view in Devon. So it shows the River Tamar, but you'd never guess it. You'd think that was a imaginary Italian view, where of course the Constable shows a view over Dedham Vale with a real bridge in the middle Devon. That you saw in the earlier exemplar as well. One thing I should point out, and I probably won't use the pointer because I know that people online wouldn't be able to see, but you can probably see anyway in the Turner. Can you see two small female figures? One on the bank, sitting by a boulder, and the other on the left, sort of leaning as if towards the tree. Those two girls are said to be based on Turner's two illegitimate daughters. So Evelina and Georgiana, we don't know for absolute sure, but this is another difference between them that I want to, in terms of biography and what they achieved in relation to the complications in the rest of their life, is you think, so Turner, for Turner, art comes first, always. He actually said at some stage that, you know, married men shouldn't be artists. They don't have time. You've got to devote yourself to art. So, and he didn't really look after or allow or cater for the financial needs of his two girls. So basically he had an affair with somebody called Sarah Danby, who was a widow, and then they kind of eventually lost touch. And then the daughters and other members of the family contested the will, so in the end they did get some money. But so Turner did form very close friendships with some of his patrons, Walter Fawkes, the third Earl of Egremont, and in later life he had a companion, but still art always came first. Constable was quite the opposite. He fell in love with this woman on the right, Maria Bicknell, who was the granddaughter of the local vicar in East Bergholt, and he fell in love with her as early as 1809. But the vicar was either a bit of a snob who thought, oh, well, Constable's father's, you know, not in the professions, is in trade. I'm not going to let my daughter anywhere near it. We're not really quite sure why, but with the problems coming from the grandfather, her father, who was a well-placed solicitor to the Prince Regent and to the Admiralty, wouldn't give it. So eventually, it's sort of rather romantic story, really. So they got married eventually in 1816 without her parents' permission. But in Constable, these amazing oil sketches that he made, this one from the back of East Berkholt House, where he was born, we saw the house earlier, looking across to the rectory, which is probably where he first met her, and this sort of glorious sunrise. Constable projects into his work all the intensity of his emotions in a way that, and it's almost his personal biography. His art and his life are kind of almost interchangeable in that sense. And then this lovely old sketch lower left. Constable, of course, is known for his commitment to sketching in the open air, consistently through a very long period. It was very fashionable at this date for British artists to make oil sketches in the open air around this time. But most artists only continued the practice for the odd summer here or there when the weather was good. It was a bit of a nuisance to carry around all your materials. Oil took quite a long time to dry. They were on the move anyway, most of these artists. So Constable is one of the rare people who persisted with oil sketching from nature for a long period because he had the advantage of being in East Berkholt and being able to store his materials in his father's mill, in the little studio in East Berkholt his father bought him. So he had all the practicalities there to his advantage and the determination to do so, and his feeling that it was important to transcribe the world as you saw it. But briefly, and again, I'm sure this will be in the exhibition, briefly, Turner did have a phase where he too was painting in oil in the open air. He hired a boat and he went up the Thames as far as Guildford, as you can see. These two examples are both on panel. He later did some larger versions on canvas. We're not quite sure if those are open air studies or not. It can be difficult to tell, obviously. But I show you these as if to prove how untypical they are for Turner. It's the moment where Turner comes closest to Constable, only later to depart from this method of expressing himself. So some comparisons now then, some direct comparisons with Constable beginning to catch up with Turner. So we're now in 1813. Constable is just beginning to be noticed by the critics. Turner has been for a long time. And I thought I'd show you this particular Turner, Frosty Morning, which is short of in the exhibition because it's such a famous painting and much loved. But it's again not entirely typical of Turner in that it shows Turner tends to do sunrise or sunsets. Constable tends to show his subjects under midday light. That is quite a broad distinction between the two of them. But Turner's picture does show quite a naturalistic scene for him. And it is based on a personal observation, though it wouldn't have been made directly from nature. So we mentioned that one of Turner's patrons, the one to whom he was closest of all, perhaps, was Walter Fawkes, Farnley Hall, sort of between Leeds and Otley, and spent a lot of time up there. And of course, in those days, the best way of getting around was to take carriages or post-chaises. And in the distance, and if you look at the road receding right into the distance, just profiled against that hill is a receding a carriage moving away. And Turner said that this scene was based on a memory of seeing on a very, very frosty morning with that kind of light. It's a kind of, not a strong light, but it's picking up the frost on the ground. And at the roadside, there are people sort of filling in ditches. And it's again the little girl with the blue skirt with a kind of hair wrapped around her shoulder to keep her warm is probably also based on Evelina Turner's eldest. So, and then Constable getting bigger now, 50 by 40 inches, that picture on the left, which is half of a full-length portrait size, beginning to get noticed, but again, a subject at the back of Flatford Mill, looking towards the footbridge near a cottage at Flatford, and by the lock, the gates of the lock, with a kind of water pouring through. He loved, you know, that famous letter where he says to John Fisher, his great friend, that he loves such things, rotting banks and vegetation and dampness. These scenes made me a painter, and I'm grateful. Actually, interestingly enough, one of Constable's greatest friends, I mentioned he was a phenomenally good letter writer, was John Fisher, Archdeacon John Fisher. We'll come back to him when we move on to Salisbury shortly. But John, he had this very joshing relationship with Fisher. They wrote each other all these letters, and Fisher said, "Oh, great, you're doing well, you know, your picture, I really like your picture, things are coming on," always encouraging him. Later bought his pictures. He said, but like Napoleon, you're beaten only by the frost. Think of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And because Fisher said he preferred Turner's on that occasion. So Turner, huge career, lived a lot longer. You think Constable died in 37, Turner not until 1851. So I'm having to sort of condense and pick the key moments and key picture types in terms of making a comparison. But very famous, of course, is Dido building Carthage, which was one of the pictures that he wanted to hang by Claude in the National Gallery. In fact, originally, it's complicated with this world, and I don't have time to go into it here, but originally he wanted to leave all his finished exhibition pictures to the National Gallery. In the end, the nation got everything, the lanes, the unfinished pictures, all the works on paper. But of course, most of them ended up at the Tate, because the Tate was originally a branch, an extension of the National Gallery, until it became independent. But to this day, by his bequest, by the nature of the bequest which was honoured, this hangs next to or near this Claude, and you can obviously see the homage. Of course, Turner, we were talking about the importance of the hierarchy, and Turner, historical landscape depending on Poussin, here depending on Claude, but also the message is very much about the rise and fall of empires. And he loved representing the rise and decline of the Carthaginian Empire, because he loved the analogy between Carthage and Rome on the one hand, and England and France, who were constantly at war. So the implications of, you know, empires overreaching themselves were always kind of in the back of his mind, and is what he would have expected viewers to have appreciated. So moving on now, because I've got my watch here, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time so we can have questions if necessary. Again, I'm trying to do side by side with the timing. Battle of Waterloo. This I'm sure will be in the exhibition, and Flatford Mill. Again, accentuating the difference, not just in handling, and obviously one's a night scene, one's a full day scene, but how they are now on more or less level pegging in terms of the critics who are noticing their work more, but also Turner consistently is treating historical landscapes based on real events. So the Battle of Waterloo, instead of showing it as artists might have done in the past, as a heroic event, you know, with the British and all the, you know, generals on their stallions, you know, looking very happy with the victory, he actually shows all the carnage. So that was sort of a bit daring, you could say, I suppose, all the wives looking, you know, for their husbands, the dead soldiers. So there's a big distinction there between what Turner's doing in subject matter and Constable, who's doing another view on the banks of the River Stour. Shortly before, he was due to leave Suffolk for good, because, of course, he married Marino in 1816, and the family knew that the parental house would have to be sold. So from now on, Constable's life is in London. So with that, everything changes for Constable. So now, I don't know if any of you would have seen the exhibition at Tate Britain back in 2006, Constable, the Great Landscapes. But what we did with that was to reunite the so-called 6 foot wide landscapes, or roughly 6 foot high, with their full scale sketches. Now, I'm not going to show you any full scale sketches in this because we'll be here forever, but those of you who saw the exhibition will remember them. So Constable has now decided to paint big, and everything is very time consuming because he has to pay 2 for the and you only get, if he sells it at all, the price of 1. And of course, these pictures are big. Who's going to buy them? But it brings him exactly what he wants. He gets notice because it's wide. The critics are really impressed. They think he looks like Rysdale or Hobbema. And he gets what he covets, the associateship of the Royal Academy. So I asked you to remember the leaning figure early on, in chalks, pencil, the very softly drawn, very beautiful muscular man leaning that way. Here we have him reversed, and he becomes the figure who's straining to open a lock gate in this very famous picture of the lock, which used to belong to the Thyssen, but sadly, in a rather unfortunate outcome, was sold out of the collection. I've now shown you a different view of the Royal Academy rooms adjacent, and you can see that uprights, albeit a portrait, often got in the middle of the wall as well. And this was the first picture by Constable to be bought directly off the Royal Academy walls. So much so that Constable painted a repetition because it was so impressive, buyers. This was sold to a kind of up-and-coming textile merchant who made a lot of money in textiles called Walter Morrison. And as I say, Constable painted a replica. So the other thing about Constable to bear in mind is that the extraordinary thing is, having struggled so long to get his art off the ground, the Haywain, incidentally, was the third in this series of river. There were 6 6-footers of River Stour subjects, and the Haywain was the third, and the 4th was the one below. Suddenly, Constable had a bit of luck where Jericho, who was over in London showing the raft of the Medusa, saw the Haywain, and he was just gobsmacked by how interesting and fascinating it was. He absolutely loved the free touches. Now, nowadays, we think the Haywain's quite a polished picture, but compared with French art of the period, it was quite free with lots of little broken brushstrokes. He went back and told all the other artists, and then a dealer called John Arrowsmith thought, oh, I'm going to buy a couple of those, showing them at the Salon in Paris, and which is what he did. And Constable won a gold medal. And Turner was not in that salon. So suddenly Constable becomes the talked about artist in Paris. So, you know, it's kind of backwards and forwards at this time. So running ahead still now, what I'm going to do for the rest of the lecture now, just over the next 5-10 minutes, slightly over time, is just to do a bit of contextual stuff about other locations these 2 artists went to. Constable, we know, because his wife sadly had a tubercular condition, he was moving the family constantly to where there was better air, because obviously in those days we've got a lot of coal burning in the centre of London, extremely unhealthy. So Constable eventually had 7 children. So imagine the cost, the financial cost of moving your family to Hampstead or Brighton, which is where we see you went later, and all the maids and staff and nurses, all the people needed to move with the family and the complications. So I think it's amazing that Constable got as much done as he did with all that going on. But of course, his cloud studies are tremendously well known and famous. Oil on paper, one here on the right in the Tate. I've no doubt there'll be plenty of these on display in the exhibition at the Tate. But also, of course, Turner skies are amazing too. And you get a lot of sunrises and sunsets and amazing effects over the sea in Margate, where he said you saw the most beautiful skies in Europe. But I'm showing you here a couple of pages from a sketchbook in the Tate that's devoted to nothing but skies and watercolour, and they are astonishingly beautiful. So here I'm just going to pop in a bit of politics, planning issues. Now, I actually wanted to say that Constable went on painting skies everywhere, Brighton, Salisbury, and I mentioned, remember Archdeacon John Fisher. And John Fisher, whose uncle was the Bishop of Salisbury. So in those days when, you know, there was true nepotism, you got your favoured nephew the nicest position. I mean, he was, you know, qualified rector, archdeacon, but he got the sort of living when he became a canon. He moved into Leadenhall, which was for canon residentiary, and Constable stayed there a lot, especially in 1820, also in 1829, and he couldn't resist making beautiful sky studies, of which there are about, I don't know, 16, 17 of these skies overlooking Harlem Ridge, and also the gardens in the foreground, which had been planted by John Fisher's predecessor called William Douglas, and actually 80% of the gardening survives. But the politics that I mentioned is because on the lower left, you can see a beautiful view, quite small in the V&A. I don't think this is going to be in the Tate exhibition, of the kitchen garden at Leadenhall. And these town walled historic kitchen gardens are incredibly rare. I think there are probably only 4 left in the UK. But unfortunately, the Dean and Chaplain of Salisbury Cathedral, they desperately need a new archive. Good on them, I agree about archives. But unfortunately, they want to put it directly over the wall kitchen garden and destroy it in the process. And this archive is going to be huge because the area is very vulnerable to flooding, so it has to be put on still. So I'm afraid I'm not in favour of this development, so if any of you are, do quickly. And more skies by Constable in Brighton. Beautiful. So I mentioned that he carried on oil on paper, incredibly beautiful. Again, I'm sure there'll be a lot of these in the exhibition. So why Brighton? So I mentioned Hampstead because Constable's wife, Maria, needed to see her. When Hampstead didn't work, they had to try Brighton. Brighton Constable didn't like. This is where the Prince Regent spent a lot of his time. So a lot of kind of flunkies sort of went to Brighton to show off their nice latest fashions, and you can see the Royal Pavilion in the background. And Brighton really was going places. It had been just no fishing port, but they then built this high-tech chain pier, which opened in 23 just before Constable arrived. And that actually was for steamboats to go over towards Dieppe and back to Brighton. So Constable didn't like that aspect of it. He told John Fisher famously in a letter it was nothing but Piccadilly by the seaside, because he couldn't bear all this kind of urban intrusion on a natural site. But he famously painted this view of the chain pier, which I'm sure will be the exhibition. You can see the juxtaposition of the natural fisherman on the left, who's there's no port at Brighton, so boats delivering material had to sort of land on the foreshore. But you can see the intrusion of the visitors, including these women who are being buffeted by the wind, holding up their parasol. But of course, now this is when the rivalry starts stepping up, because Turner is actually pretty fed up that Constable moves into a non-pastoral mode. So up until now, we've seen Constable doing all these Suffolk scenes and so on. And then he did a lot of Hampstead scenes. And then he suddenly, having said he didn't like Brighton, he suddenly thought, oh, maybe I better vary my subject matter a bit. I really want to become a full Royal Academician. So Turner's riposte is later to paint this with the third Earl of Egremont, but to see the chain pier from the opposite side. And of course, this is built into the panelling at Petworth House, so you probably know it well, along with 3 other scenes by Turner. I'm sorry, I'm moving on quite fast now because I don't want to go on too much over time, but I popped this in as a reminder, and this will be in the exhibition, and is something one doesn't really associate with Constable, is that Turner made many highly finished watercolours specifically to be engraved. So he was commercially very savvy. He started, I mentioned 1790s, just travelling all around the UK. A lot of his more timid watercolours then were translated in engravings. He learned how to handle the publishers very sharply, decided not to let them have the watercolours after a while as part of the contract, hung on to the watercolours. But he made a lot of money from this. And of course, it meant that these engraved images ended up in people's homes at a time when, no television, no digital, no nothing. That was your way of, making your reputation through engravings. So imagine this and translate to this happening throughout Turner's entire life. So what I'm going to do as we now finish is just end up with the classic famous rivalries between the two, which I get a bit fed up with all this because it's in the Mike Leigh movie and it tends to get overinterpreted because, as Nicola Morby makes clear in her book, then and now we want to see them as rivals, but occasionally they did clash. And in 1831, Constable by now was a full Royal Academician, as we've seen. And when you were a full Royal Academician, you could take turns, be elected to be what was called on the hanging committee, which is where it was no problem with Royal Academicians. They didn't need their work to be assessed as to whether it was good enough to go in. Although you did have to select works by other artists who were less well known. But the worst or best bit of the job, depending on your point of view, was the installation. And Constable that year did Salisbury Cathedral, famous picture. And that year, Turner was hanging, had submitted this along with another similarly brightly coloured canvas. And to cut a long story short, because this is just the lead up to the big battle, which won't be very long, I promise you. But Constable moved after the, we assume that in the prominent position, there were 2 brightly coloured, Claudian coloured, classical looking Turners, and 1 sort of colder coloured Constable, Salisbury. And the 3 were hanging more all side by side. At the last minute, Constable made an adjustment and he put Salisbury Cathedral in the middle of the 2 Turners, which probably looked better. But Turner was so fed up that allegedly this incident was his revenge. Now I'm going to go forward and then back. Right. Have any of you seen the famous Mike Leigh movie? Yeah. But this is a famous incident where actually you get Constable and Turner doing the opposite to each other here. This time we've got Turner with a cold coloured marine, very Dutch looking, quite small, and Constable with a very untypical view of the opening of Waterloo Bridge, which happened years back, so people were puzzled that he submitted it so late, but it was a complicated picture. And typically for Constable, there's lots of colour, a lot of red. He called it my Harlequin's jacket, because, you know, when they opened Waterloo Bridge, there were all these fancy barges, the Prince Regent, the Lord Mayor. So this is based on fact. So in the so-called varnishing days at the Royal Academy, before the exhibition opened, artists could touch up their pictures, but there was a little bit of sort of joshing between artists, and they made jokes and sometimes put little touches on each other's pictures. You know, I mean, they really didn't. But we do know that, and this is enacted in the Mike Leigh movie, so all these are kind of mock-ups that were made for the film. So Timothy Spall, who played Turner, he comes in and he lands a red blob on his coal marine. Then he walks off, and then he comes back the next day or 2 days later, still varnishing tape, and he fashions that red blob into a boy, which actually in the original picture is not that bright, but you can probably see it bobbing on the water. And then, of course, Constable said, Turner's been here and fired a gun. So very quickly, because we really are at the end now, I'm just going to literally flash through these slides. So Constable ill late on, returned to doing highly finished watercolours. Old Sarah, I think this is going to be an exhibition. And actually, Constable was a very accomplished watercolourist. He just didn't use watercolour very often. Old Sarah, original site of Salisbury Cathedral, which was then moved down lower onto the plain. And when Turner does his highly finished watercolour, he shows the view looking back to Salisbury from Old Sarum. And there may be a hint of the politics there, because we're in the build-up to the Reform Bill. And of course, Late Sarum was a notorious Brighton borough. It was completely uninhabited and returned to members to the Blue Rigi, acquired by the Tate not long ago, one of 3 sublime late watercolours by Turner of these Swiss views. And that I'm sure will be in the exhibition. But I'm doing it here just to say there were many more years of Turner's travels, more of the same. It's all beautiful. Little views of France made to be engraved for the rivers of France. Constable, in the meantime, towards the end, his handling gets sort of wilder and more frenetic, and he revisits old Suffolk scenes. So I've got a friend called Sarah Cope who gives excellent lectures. She does technical analysis of Constable, and she calls her Constable lectures the Jackson Pollock of the And then finally, and this is the last slide, and I won't go into any detail here, but both artists produced engraved series to promote some of their ideas about landscape art. And this is where I see them both as colleagues rather as rivals. But I think the frontispieces to both tell you as much as you need to know about the differences between the two. I mean, there's some difference in date. Turner's is much earlier, but he's presenting himself as the ultimate classicist in the steps of these famous masters. And Constable's presenting himself, you'll see a little artist there in the foreground sketching, as the one who cares about his own native landscape. And that in the end is what matters most, the chiaroscuro of nature and one's reaction to a landscape you know best. So I think I'll finish there.